Hello and welcome to this May 2017 tutorial. Today we're going to be looking at the UI generally, and I'm going to be providing a basic overview of what we can do in the software. But we're going to be keeping it nice and short. We'll be looking at viewport control, we'll be looking at primitive control, how we can move, rotate and scale primitives or models. And we're also going to be having a look at some of the menus, some of the ribbon rollouts, and finally we're going to be having a look at some features of the modeling toolkit, where a lot of the features that we're going to talk about at the top are actually replicated. So let's start by having a look at some of the menus at the top. If you've used any software before, some of these might seem familiar to you, notably File, Edit and Help. These tend to be in every program. We're not going to kind of have a look at Help for the most part, it's irrelevant, but certainly within File we're going to see a lot of our basic administration tasks. Things like new scene, open scene, save scene and save scene as. We're also going to see some send to functions, most notably send to 3ds Max, send to Unity and send to Unreal. We also have a send to Mudbox option, and if none of you have used Mudbox before or have ever heard of Mudbox before, it is an Autodesk package that allows you to sculpt. It might not be as good as ZBrush, but it is a very nice piece of software that you can look at that gives you a very basic, very gentle introduction to sculpting and to some of the workflows, and it's really a great starting point if you don't have access to ZBrush or if you don't kind of have money for a license. So export all and export selection are the next two we're going to have a look at. These basically allow us to take whatever we've modeled, package them up in either an FBX or an OBJ, and there are lots of other formats that we can use, ready to be imported into other packages, whether that be CryEngine, whether that be Final Effects, whatever program you're using, and this allows us to export absolutely everything in the scene. Export selection does pretty much the same thing, however it will only export the object that you have selected. Now the most important thing in Edit is undo and redo. Any student of 3D modeling, anybody that's been doing 3D modeling for a long time, anybody that's been doing anything for a long time will know that undo is going to be your best friend in nearly every situation. And as with every program, the shortcut key for undo is Control-Z. Again, you can click on the button. If you want to click on the button, just click on Edit, click Undo. But my advice with the shortcut keys generally, I know there are some of you out there who really like pressing buttons and really like the physicality of clicking on something, which I can appreciate, of course. But what I would say is, once you're comfortable with the software and you kind of know where everything is, please try and add in some of these shortcut keys. Some of the shortcut keys, are convoluted and you'll never use, but certainly basic things like undo, redo, new scene, save, those kinds of things can really speed you up. Later on we'll be looking at something called extrude, and that's one of the most common functions that you can use in 3D, and again, knowing the shortcut key for that will save you a lot of time. So the next thing we're going to have a look at, or the next three, we're going to have a look at Mesh, Edit Mesh and Mesh Tools. Now within these three menus you're going to find your basic modeling processes. Combine and Boolean are probably going to be the most common things you'll be using in here. In Edit Mesh you're going to be looking again mostly at extrude, merge. These kinds of things can be very important, can be very basic. And within Mesh Tools, things like Connect, Multicut and Quad Draw are really useful, fundamental 3D modeling tools. There will be a tutorial later on that will go through these in more detail, but for now we're just kind of having a look at the UI generally. Now within Mesh Display, this is where we can control things like smoothing groups. So if you're from 3ds Max and you've used 3ds Max before, the smoothing groups work very differently. When I transitioned from Max to Maya, this was probably one of the things that kind of caught me off guard the most, was not actually having a number that I could apply to a smoothing group, because in Max obviously you have smoothing group numbers. Again, in a future tutorial we'll be looking through how we can use these smoothing groups to create some really awesome effects, but for now just know that's where we can find those kinds of things. So let's now have a look at the ribbon rollout. The default option for this is polygons, and I'm going to take this opportunity just to have a look at the contents of this this tab. Now you'll notice firstly that it's split up into 3 sections. Okay. The first section deals with primitives. Now if you've never done any 3D modeling before, a primitive is just a basic 3D shape. That's all it is. And they're traditionally used for modeling larger objects. Things like planes and boxes are very common start points for things like firearms, faces, those kinds of things. Whereas things like cylinders can be really useful for more cylindrical objects like barrels, oil drums, and those kinds of things. Now, as I said, this first section deals with primitives, and all we have to do to get a primitive in the scene is just left click one of these primitives and it will appear in the center of the grid. And I'm just going to leave that there just for now so that we can have a look at that later. Let's have a look at the second section. Now this second section deals with polygon control, and what I mean by that, if we have a look at moving our mouse over one of these, a lot of the things that exist in Mesh Tools here and exist in Edit Mesh and Mesh have been duplicated here. Things like multi-cut, we saw that in Mesh Tools. Things like extrude, we saw that in Edit Mesh. Okay, so a lot of the tools that exist here are kind of copy and pasted from here. These are the most common tools, and they're put here basically for your convenience. We will go through one of these. We'll go through all of these one by one in a later tutorial. But as I say, these are the polygon control tools. Now the third and final section of the polygons rollout deals with unwrapping. It deals with UV mapping. The first 4 and 5 options here are specifically to do with projection and the creation of seams. This box here opens up the UV editor. If you have come from 3ds Max and you're transitioning or trying to, Maya is nowhere near as modifier based. So in 3ds Max you have a modifier list, and you're constantly adding unwraps, edit polys, these kinds of things. That doesn't exist in Maya, and we'll be looking at how to unwrap primitives in a later tutorial. But for now, that is where the unwrap tools lie. Now, we're not going to have a look at every single one of these tabs, but I think some of them are worth mentioning. Now, earlier we mentioned Mudbox, and I still believe that Mudbox is a great place to start sculpting. But very recently, Maya has introduced sculpting tools into Maya itself. These have been lifted almost directly from Mudbox. So if you want to have a play around with sculpting, then feel free to use these features. As again, same with the polygons, we have 3 separate sections. The first section deals with sculpting, the second section deals with different kinds of content browsers and those kinds of things, and the third and final section deals with kind of more whole functions like cloning, for instance, and erasing. Now, animation and rigging are 2 menus that we're very briefly going to fly past, because for the most part, animation and rigging tools you'll only need if you're animating and rigging. There is very little crossover between modeling and rigging and animation. But these are where kind of the skeleton tools are, and in animation you're going to find things like the constraint tools, you're going to find things like the keyframe tools, and those kinds of fundamental animation tools. We will be having a tutorial later on that deals with basic animation and how we can use these tools to create movement in our scene, but for now just know that's where the tools are. Now, the final tool we're going to have a look at today up here is just the rendering toolkit. Now, within here we've got a variety of different methods, and you'll notice that they're not kind of broken up by an actual divider. So we'll go through these as groups. They do exist in groups even if there is no divider specifically. So on the left hand side here, nearly everything here deals with lighting. Okay, so some lighting is specific to Arnold, and that is just the name of the Maya renderer. Okay, we're not going to go into Arnold today, but there are 2 types of renderer, or there are more than 2, but there are 2 main types of renderer in Maya. You have the Maya hardware and software renderer, and you also have Arnold, and Arnold is sort of the replacement for Mental Ray. So let's move on. So here we have some different material presets. We can apply these to the cube here if we wanted to. We're not going to. There will be a future tutorial where we look at assigning materials and how we can control those materials. And that's pretty much it. The final section in here deals with things like batch rendering, which we will not be going into in any real detail, but this is essentially just rendering across a network, rendering multiple things across a network. Okay, wonderful. So I'm just going to click back in polygons. We've already got a primitive in the scene. So what we're going to do now is we're going to have a look at how we can control the viewport. Now, for those of you who are brand new to 3D, welcome to what is our nightmare. For most of us, this is a labour of love, and we're kind of kidnapped by the process. So you're about to hopefully embark on that journey. But if you're brand new to 3D modelling and you've never done it before, the concept of a viewport might seem a bit alien to you, but there are two types of viewport. You have perspective viewports and you have orthographic viewports. The biggest difference between the two of these is the perspective viewports give you depth. So if I have a look at this cube in the middle here, there is some depth. Some of you might argue that actually it's quite difficult to tell how far away that is, but for the most part, if I created, say for instance, another one of these and I moved them apart, there is some semblance of depth. You can see that they're not occupying the same space. You can see that this one is kind of slightly in front of this one, and that this one is slightly to the right. And that's why the perspective viewport is where you're going to spend most of your time. But let's have a look at some of the other viewports. So in order to open up these viewports, there are two things you can do. The easiest way of opening up the 4x4 view is just by tapping spacebar. Now once you've tapped spacebar, you'll notice that we end up with 4 viewports. We have the perspective in the top right, we have the side viewport in the bottom right, in the bottom left we have the front viewport, and finally in the top left we have the top viewport. The viewport names are listed very clearly at the bottom of the viewport, so there's no way of getting them wrong. And you can see very clearly the difference between the orthographic viewports, so the viewports with no depth, and the viewports with some perspective, okay, some depth perception. For the most part, as I've already said, perspective viewport is going to be what we're going to be using most. The other viewports are incredibly useful for fine-tuning, fine placement, and those kinds of things. So do not neglect these viewports. They are useful. We can transition between the viewports just by left-clicking in the viewport. Now we know which viewport's active because when we left click we get this grey box around it, and as I left click in the other viewports you will see that that kind of follows along. Alright, so what we're going to do now is we're just going to tap spacebar again with the perspective viewport open, and that's going to bring us back now to this full screen view. Now I just want to mention something very briefly. When we press spacebar then we got a little glimpse of a menu. I'm just going to hold down spacebar now. Hopefully these seem familiar to you, and they should, because these are a direct copy of the menu sets up the top here. The Maya UI is very modular. You can hide bits of it, you can delete bits of it. This is sort of the replacement for those functions. Now in this video we're not going to go through user interface customization, but there will be a video later on where we have a look at how we can customize Maya to work for us. To get rid of this menu, we just let go of spacebar. So I mentioned earlier that there were two ways of transitioning between the viewports. One we've just looked at. The second is over here. We have 4 buttons here, well 3 buttons that deal with the viewport configuration. The top gives us this view that we have here. The second button here will bring us to this cross section. And we can transition between these very quickly. So again, if you don't like hotkeys, this is the place to come. Some people like to have 2 viewports open at a time, and this is the option for you. So this will give you the front viewport and also the perspective viewport. But note, you can change these viewports at any time by coming to panels and by coming to the various different viewports and choosing those. Okay, so as I said, perspective and orthographic. Perspective, this is the perspective viewport, and within orthographic we can change front, side and top. I'm just going to go back to the full screen view. So let's have a look now at how we can control these viewports. The first function we're going to have a look at is zooming in and zooming out. Now this might be obvious to some of you, but to some it might not. The hotkey for this, or the control for this, is actually wheel mouse forward to zoom in, and wheel mouse back to zoom out. Nice and easy. Rotation is a little bit more complicated because we have to get the keyboard involved at this point. In order to rotate, we hold Control and we press left click. Oh, sorry, we press Alt and we press left click. And that is going to give us rotation, and we can rotate around specific objects. Finally, let's have a look at panning. And this is the same selection of keys. This is Alt and middle mouse. Okay, and this is how we control the viewports. So we Alt left click to rotate, Alt middle click to pan, and we zoom in and out by using the wheel mouse. And these are the three primary ways of controlling the camera or the viewport. Now sometimes we get a bit overzealous, we get a bit excited, and we might turn things upside down, we might move them out of space, we might go mad, we might completely lose where we are. In which case the easiest way to get back is by pressing F. Okay, this will bring us back to our viewport, and this will allow us to go back to the objects. You can also press A, which gives you a very similar result. So F and A, they're the two kind of go back to the grid panic buttons that you can press. Now the great thing about F is that if I have more than one object, F will actually allow me to focus on that particular object, and this can be very, very useful if you want to rotate around a specific object. So now, lastly, before we have a look at some of the modeling toolkit, we're going to be looking at how we can control the primitive. Now the default selection type is what we call the object selection type, which means if I left click on this object, I get a gizmo and I get a highlighted box. Now this gizmo allows me to move in various different directions. I'm just going to rotate the camera around here so we can see the gizmo a little bit better. And you'll notice as I move my mouse over these various different axes, they kind of grey out. And that's because if I left click on these axes, it will lock that movement. So I can only move in the y-axis or the z-axis or the x-axis. And that's what these arrows represent. Now you will notice that there are some squares in between these axes. These allow us to move in two directions. So this here, for instance, allows us to move on the z-axis and the x-axis, and we can move like so. The blue obviously allows us to move on the green and the red, and finally the red here allows us to move on the green and the blue. So we can kind of move in two axes rather than one. If you want to move uniformly, then all we have to do is move our mouse into the center of the gizmo here, and there'll be a little box in there that sort of turns a green color, and we can move that box around. Now you'll notice that we have a blue square over here. That's because our movement tool is selected, and the hotkey for this is W. Okay, and you notice if you move your mouse over these tools here, it will give you a breakdown of what they do, and it will also give you the hotkey. So that's moving. The next function is rotating. This is incredibly important. And you'll notice that the gizmo is subtly different. In fact, it's totally different. But we do have some similarities. So we have the different axes, and they grey out when I move my mouse over the top of them. And again, same as with moving, this allows me to clamp the rotation to one axis. And by doing this, it means I can make fine adjustments to particular axes, but I can also uniformly rotate without constraining the axes at all. Just by moving my mouse into the middle of this circle, you notice it turns grey, turns a darker grey, and I can rotate in any particular direction that I like. So finally, let's have a look at scale. The hotkey for that is R, and this looks much more like the movement tool. And again, this allows us to scale in one direction, multiple directions, or uniformly. So just to recap, movement is W, E is R. Sorry, movement is W, rotate is E, and scale is R. Okay, and we can flick between these, nice and easy. These are the hotkeys I would suggest that you learn first: the movement, the rotate, the scale. You'd be surprised how often you flick between these things, and when you kind of boil it down, most of the time that you spend learning is kind of looking for buttons and moving the mouse to different parts of the screen to try and find what you're looking for. Just remember, you know, if you play first-person shooters, you move using W, rotate is E, and scale is R. And the way I remember that is that rotate should be R, and it's not, it's E. And I just remember that.
That might be silly, but that's kind of how I remembered it when I was learning. And these hotkeys are the same in 3ds Max as well. So movement is W, rotate is E, and scale is R. So finally, let's have a look at the modeling toolkit. Now the modeling toolkit is new, so we haven't had a chance to have a look at this, and this was actually one of the reasons why a lot of people didn't transition to Maya sooner, because a lot of these things here, which make kind of accessing the modeling tools very easy, never used to exist. So yeah, this is a great addition, and this will really help you kind of practice the skills. Now I mentioned earlier when we were in Mesh, Edit Mesh and Mesh Tools that a lot of this stuff is kind of copy and pasted throughout the UI. Not only within these menus, but also at the top in the polygon ribbon here. And again, those are copy and pasted over here. This is purely for convenience. Okay. So I mentioned multi-cut, target weld, and quad draw earlier. These are really useful tools. Extrude, bridge, add divisions, and bevel, again, really, really useful. The majority of what you'll be using will be in this menu. And in future tutorials, we'll be looking at how we can use these to actually create 3D models. Now, the very last thing I want to talk about, whilst we have this modeling toolkit open, is the different selection types that we have available to us in Maya. Now, if you're new to modeling, some of this stuff will not be familiar at all. If you've come from 3ds Max, then it's the bog standard vertice, edge, and face. We also have element as well, but that isn't called element, it's called object. So that's kind of the way that they've sort of transitioned that. But if I hold right click on this object, you notice I get a different selection here. So these are my selection types. Object mode is what we're in currently, and this allows me to select objects and move them as whole objects. If I hold right click and change to face, you'll notice as I move my mouse now over specific faces, they glow red. And again, if I left click on that mouse, or left click on my mouse and on that face, I can drag, I can move, I can rotate, and I can scale faces in any direction that I like. And I can do this to any face. Let's have a look at some of the other selection types. Vertex. A vertice is the point in which two edges meet or intersect. So here at the top I have 4 vertices, and at the bottom I have 4 vertices. Now I can either control these separately by clicking on one at a time, or I can control them together by selecting more than one. And I can just hold left click and drag over those two, and I can move them about. I can select more than 2 if I wish by holding and pressing left click whilst holding shift, and this will select multiple objects for me. Now some of you out there might say, but you know, surely we should be pressing control. If you do that in Maya, you'll actually be deselecting the vertices. Okay, and again, that's a very annoying transition habit from Max to Maya. In Max it's control, in Maya it's shift, so just get used to that. Let's have a look at edge. Edge again is essentially the point between 2 vertices, and we can select the edges and we can move them in exactly the same way we can the faces and the vertices. And that pretty much concludes our intro, if you will, to the Maya 2017 UI. I hope this has been useful to you. If you think I've missed anything that would be useful, feel free to throw general abuse at me in the comments below. If you thought it was useful, let me know. We're going to be adding more videos over the next couple of weeks, so make sure you check back regularly and don't miss a thing. Thank you very much.